Hello, kindred explorers of the ancient mysteries. This is Govin here with TeutonicsHamanism.com. A theme I've been covering in these introductory videos has been this idea of ethno-religion or ethno-indigenous religion, and I really want to get more into this idea and kind of talk about what it is versus what it's not, because these more modern religions that have emerged out of pagan religions, so monotheism comes out of polytheism, often where there's a pantheon of deities, and then at some point there's the strongest, most powerful deity, and the other deities are said to be just another face of that one main deity. So that's how monotheism gets created. You kind of see this in various circles when they say, if it's not God, they say it's spirit, or they say it's this, that, or the other thing, and it's all these deities and spirits and things, or even people, are just different facets of the face of the one true God. And yeah, people can be free to look at spirituality in that way. I'm not advocating against that. I'm simply advocating for what our indigenous ancestors did pre-agriculture, and part of that was not monotheism. They were polytheistic, they were animistic, they were shamanistic in the structuring of their beliefs. So I talked about the evolutionary tree of religion in recent videos, and I'm going to refer to that again for most of this video, and you can either pull it up or you can look at the image I put up on the screen, and we're going to zoom in on different parts and talk about what different groups of people could look at doing in terms of investigating and reconstructing the practices of their indigenous ancestors. So it is going to vary quite a bit. On one hand, if we're looking at things that I'm looking at, the Nordic areas of Europe have been very new to monotheism, yet at the same time there wasn't much preservation of the beliefs and practices of the Norse or the other Germanic tribes, whereas in the Middle East there was in some cases the transition away from those religions many thousands of years ago, but there was better preservation of them, so people can reconstruct some of those beliefs, such as the polytheism of the Babylonians, if you happen to descend from them. So as an aside, if you like the idea of what I'm talking about, of doing what it is your ancestors did and kind of recreating that, what you're going to need to do is either look into your own family's written history of your family lines, if you're able to do that to a great extent, and if you know the history of the regions that your family come from, you can do that, and or you can get genetic testing done. I recently had 23andMe testing done, and I'm going to do a video about that, more health-related video in the near future, but I got my ancestry done, and that confirmed within me what I thought, but there was a few things out of the ordinary which I thought were quite interesting to learn about, and it's very worthwhile if people are drawn to doing that, to get that done. And that can give you confidence in really knowing what part of the world you descend from, and you can look into the religions of those peoples. So let's kind of start, I guess we'll start in Europe. That's what I've focused on, and we're going to kind of go around the globe and talk about larger group populations. It's probably too much to cover to try and get too specific. Within Europe, you more or less had 4 groups. There's definitely subdivisions of all these, but you had the Celtic peoples, the Germanic tribes or Teutonic tribes, the Slavic peoples, as well as the more Mediterranean peoples, which you could call Greco-Roman or Hellenic. And depending on what part of Europe you descend from, you could either go with what you're most drawn to, you could go with what you believe is the greatest portion of your ancestry. So, for example, some people in the south of France might have a certain portion of their ancestry as Frankish, the Frankish tribes, which were Teutonic tribal peoples that came down and became Christian. But you might have some influence of the Greek blood in you as well. And so you'd have to kind of feel it out. You could do some genetic testing if you really wanted to be that specific. But I think it's pretty realistic that if you have a bit of either tradition in you, you can just choose whichever one you jive most with, or you can even use elements from both. I'm not against using both elements. I just feel that that which is within your blood is likely to be the most resonant with your spiritual self. So while all of Europe is mostly Christian, or at least was up until more recent times, you go back and Christianity is a Middle Eastern religion. No one is ethnically Christian in the sense of Christianity having been a offshoot of Judaism, and Judaism originating out of Cananism, which was the polytheistic sort of pagan religion of that era of the Middle East, which the monotheistic religions that are so prevalent today emerged out of. Then you have these disparate sort of occult beliefs like Rosicrucianism, Theosophy, Thelema, the Order of the Golden Dawn, Anthroposophy, and these are all sort of mishmashes of various beliefs. They're more occultic in the sense that they have esotericism at their core, and they could in some sense be more practical in revealing that sort of inner qualities that a lot of religions are attempting to recreate for the greater mass. So there's this idea of the exoteric and the esoteric. Exoteric is the pomp and circumstance of religion. It's the ritual and the shell or the husk. To actually have the internal benefits, you need to get a little bit esoteric. And I think the most hardcore Christians, if we take Christianity for example, which is a largely exoteric religion, people that are very devout Christians understand that there is an esoteric side of it. When you get really into the prayer and the meditation side of it and the repetition of prayers, like the Lord's Prayer and these other things, they have a quality within them that can have health benefits and spiritual benefits. But if you're just sort of the go to church on Sunday type person, you're missing out on the actual benefit of spirituality, in my opinion. You're going to have some effect of it in that you're probably developing some stronger morality than someone that didn't do any spiritual work whatsoever. But it's getting into the esoteric, which I think is more revealing to the potential we have on an internal level. And I think to be very effective with that, again, it's about going to your roots of what you descend from, of your genetic ancestry. So, again, the Greco-Roman traditions, that's when you see, Zeus, Jupiter. So the Roman is the Jupiter, Pluto, Venus, all the planetary names we actually have as planetary names. The Greek tradition has very similar deities with almost identical qualities and descriptions about them, but they go by Zeus, Hermes instead of Mercury, I guess Apollo instead of the sun. I believe Apollo correlates with the sun, or perhaps Apollo is Mars, Hades instead of Pluto. I'm just doing this off the top of my head. If I had actually sat down and written down each deity I could think of, I could line them up, but it's very simple to do and there's lots of information about that. But yeah, the Greco-Roman systems are interesting and they have a lot more than just those deities, of course. You can get into the animistic side of it, the views on nature and things like that. When you get to the Slavic side of things, more Eastern Europe, you have obviously deities like the thunder deity named Perun, and he goes by a range of other names as well, but he's very similar to Thor or Tyrannus in the Celtic tradition, but Thor in the Teutonic. He rides a chariot, throws a hammer or axe to smite the enemies. So you have the likes of him and many others within the Slavic traditions, and the Slavic more than the Greco-Roman resembles Teutonic religion. So the split off as people came into Europe between sort of the Mediterranean Greco-Roman traditions, the Slavic and Teutonic were likely a later split than the split between them. And actually the Celtic, while it's definitely similar to Teutonic and Slavic as well, the Celtic peoples were actually the first within Europe, and they pushed out all the way into the British Isles. If you're really interested in understanding the similarities between them, that's an interesting study in and of itself. But for the sake of attempting to keep this video short, which I understand that it already isn't, you can kind of see in that image just what the previous beliefs and traditions were as we get back from polytheism into animism. And I certainly encourage people to do whatever research they feel drawn to for whatever tradition they feel they're most connected to. Now, I will say one thing about the Celtic traditions is that there's very little left of them. They were largely oral traditions. The Druids, who were the oral keepers of that, were slaughtered by the Romans when they came in and occupied the British Isles. So there are those who have reconstructed certain elements, and if you're drawn to that, certainly do it. I have Celtic blood in me, but I'm not overly drawn to those traditions because I have the Teutonic traditions in me too, and that's just far more complete. It's not to say I'm turning my back on it. I'm open to reading them and seeing the similarities, and perhaps there will be things that I would choose to embody and practice from them in time. But like I said, it's about finding what jives with you most and going with that and explore it to whatever extent you feel you need to explore it to. Now, an interesting one, I think, is when you look at the Jewish people of today, specifically within Israel, you have two large groups of Jews, the Ashkenazi Jews and the Sephardic Jews. The exact location of the origin of Ashkenazi Jews is known to be closer to Europe than the Sephardic Jews, who are much more Mediterranean, but towards the southern side of it, basically close to Palestine and all these places that are unfortunately in conflict today. But the Ashkenazi Jews were either, there's two major theories. One is they came from Khazaria, which is near the Caucasus Mountains today, which is quite far east within Europe, and you could almost say it's not Europe, it might be Asia, it could be the Middle East, or there's some genetic evidence that perhaps the Ashkenazis came from an area closer to Italy, in which case that would technically be Europe. And what is definitely known is that all Ashkenazi Jews descend from converted peoples, so people that chose to become Jewish at a certain point in history. And so if we're talking about going back to indigenous religions, the previous beliefs before Judaism along that side of the tree is things like the Cananism or polytheism, the Mesopotamian religion. You'd have the Sumerian religion under that as well. And I think there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there. If I was of that descent genetically, I would definitely be looking at that and practicing those things as opposed to sticking with the more modern monotheistic religions. But Ashkenazi Jews would actually fall under the Slavic category, as they would have practiced that before having converted into Jews. And they might have been even Christians before that. I believe that was the part of the legend of the king that was the ruler who became Jewish. I believe he was Christian before that. But again, we're going further back before the agrarian religions or the monotheistic post-agricultural religions. And I think part of the beneficial thing with that too is if you happen to be Jewish, there exists obviously cultural tensions there. Part of that, I strongly believe, is a result of religion. It's nothing to do with people themselves. The religion of Judaism has some pretty insular elements written into its sacred texts. So if you're choosing to go back to a pre-agricultural time, you don't have to identify with that part of your culture anymore, which we could argue, which I'm not going to get into that because obviously it's controversial, but we could argue contributed to the tensions that exist between, say, Christians and Jews or Muslims and Jews. And if you happen to be Sephardic Jew, then you would be looking at, like I said, the Mesopotamian type religions that existed. And if you happen to be Muslim or Middle Eastern Christian, you would be looking at Middle Eastern shamanism, or you could even look at the ancient Egyptian religion if you're really drawn to it, if you're from sort of that Northeast African region, if you were Nubian. There were definitely some polytheistic religions which were quite far after agrarianism, which, if you're drawn to them, like I said, do them, look into them, study them, perhaps practice them, but we're trying to look at the benefits of reconnecting to the earth and having earth-centered spirituality. So there's definitely more agrarian aspects to Zoroastrianism, even the later stages of the Egyptian religion. Same is true of Sumerian religion as well, I guess, if we want to get finicky. But you do some digging and you'll find sort of the gems that are that more ancient aspect of some of these beliefs. Now, what I think is really interesting is with the sort of Indian or Vedic tradition, even though India is kind of separated by the Middle East from Europe, the Indo-European peoples, if we were to go back, say, 50,000 years are the same people who have a more recent connection genetically and ancestrally and as well as religiously than the people within the Middle East. So they ended up being more separated with the more Middle Eastern traditions in the middle, if you were to look literally at a map. But the language and the similarities between the religions and the beliefs, which are recorded in the Vedas and things like that, there's a much more recent connection. And I actually think this is why a lot of Vedic traditions have caught on so well in the West. The vast majority of non-Christian sort of spiritual beliefs within North America and even increasingly in Europe is the yoga culture. And it's partly the fact that it's a great exercise system, the Hatha yoga, but there is the spiritual element that has caught on because, in my opinion, it resonates within people's DNA and they don't even realize how recent in history that was rooted in the same traditions that their people had. So I did an image on Instagram recently comparing an image of Norse magic with a yantra from Hinduism. You can see the image here. They're pretty much identical, and both are said to be ancient. Both are similar in their properties that are said to have their magical effect in their use. They're sort of like protective seals one would use either on clothing, on a jewelry, or put the image on a wall and to sort of meditate on it. And that's just one among many similarities and common root within the Indo-European people. So if you are Indian, if you are from that Indo-Aryan region, you might want to look at the Vedic traditions. There is pretty much an unbroken line within those traditions, but again, we're trying to go pre-agriculture, so we want to go back towards more nomadic, more hunter-gatherer type traditions. And you see more of those elements within the very early sort of Vedic Hindu polytheism, but we can go even further back to Central Asian shamanism or even Proto-Indo-European shamanism. There's not really that much concrete evidence of what was going on there. But again, you go to the earliest aspects of the Vedic traditions and you can find those sort of gems and nuggets of wisdom. As we get further into Asia, we see obviously the various old Chinese systems. Taoism is a pretty unchanged shamanic tradition, even though China's been agrarian for a decently long amount of time and Taoism has existed in that. It stayed very pure and it doesn't have that sort of monotheistic, unnatural feeling to it. It's very earth-based. It has that basic concept of yin and yang, which sounds very similar to the Nordic origin of the universe coming from fire and ice. It's that hot-cold dynamic, which is the same as yin and yang, that emerged out of nothingness, which is in the Nordic tradition, the Gununga gap. So a popular agrarian religion within Asia is obviously Buddhism, and while there's some great practices within that, I'd strongly encourage people to look at the more shamanic side of the history of the region that they descend from. If you're Japanese, it's not going to be Zen, it's going to be more like Shinto. There's definitely elements from Buddhism you can use if it's useful. There's great meditations within these traditions. I'm not trying to knock them for what they've developed. And I think Buddhism probably has more gems than, say, the monotheistic religions that came out of the Middle East because they didn't become so hierarchical, but they don't have as much connection to the earth and the earth spirits and elements as the more shamanic traditions did. If you're from more northern Asia, you'd obviously have things like Tengrism, which is the origin of things like the word shaman itself. It comes from that tradition. And if you happen to be in Northern Europe from a Finnish background, that's quite different from, in terms of the both language and the beliefs of those people, the Sami. There's the Sami shamanism, there's Finnish shamanism, there's the Kosma, and that's sort of because those people migrated into Finland from further east in Asia, and so genetically they're not as connected to Europe as, say, the Scandinavian peoples are. Although around the borders, if you understand some of the Nordic traditions, there is some back and forth borrowing of the deities that occurred in the polytheistic beliefs there. Now, if you descend from the Americas, indigenous Northern American or indigenous Southern or Central American, there's a wide range of different traditions to learn about. And there's actually a fair amount still well preserved. And this is one of the few areas of the world where there's actually the most continuance of a lot of indigenous practices, which is incredible. People talk about the oppression of these groups quite a bit, and I totally agree that it needs to come to a final close and we start to help rebuild these traditions. But virtually the rest of the world has lost a lot of their culture from the widespread sort of oppressive, imperialistic mindset of the monotheistic Middle Eastern religions. So a lot of European and Asian people became so imperialistic because they lost that earth-centered connection. That's my view. So just like an abused child ends up being an abuser as they grow up, a culture that's lost its connection through oppression ends up turning around and becoming the oppressor themselves. It's very tragic. And I think for all of us to heal, we all need to reconnect to this earth-centered spirituality. That's why I'm talking about this on this channel. But you can see the wide range of different traditions there. It can get very specific, so find out what tribes you descend from and learn about them. I don't have too much background in any of this, but I did read Carlos Castaneda's book early in my teens, and it really influenced me in terms of understanding that shamanic view and also the ritualistic use of entheogens. And while I thought that was fascinating, I didn't have that sort of deep connection to it because I lacked the genetic background connected to it. And if you happen to be Polynesian, there's also some excellent traditional remnants that are still widely available that you can help preserve and actively engage in. Melanesian, Polynesian, Micronesian. It's a matter of finding out what areas you're from and just doing the research. And lastly, there's the African traditions, and similar to the Native American traditions, they're still very much alive. There's tribes still practicing a lot of these things. A lot of people who are African who are living in the New World are obviously, in many cases, descendants of slavery, and the traditions got kind of changed. Although if you're drawn to it, looking into hoodoo or even voodoo has some value there. I certainly, probably of anything, find hoodoo quite fascinating and have done a bit of reading on that. It really is a matter of understanding your ancestry. So in the case of people who are of African descent, you obviously lost the direct family line that you can trace to a specific region, although you can kind of make the assumption most African slaves were Western African. You can get a more precise understanding by actually getting genetic testing done to really zero in on what areas you came from. And then, again, do the research to delve in and understand what were the practices of those areas. So you can kind of understand just in my description of all these things how there's probably some conflicts that exist today in the world that could have some level of resolution if people would turn back to their roots. So, for example, the impact that the monotheistic religions that came out of the Middle East had, it's not a coincidence that they came out of the area of the world that was the first to develop agriculture. So much like how the overconsumption of agricultural foods had led to the diminishment of the health of indigenous humans, so they lost stature, they started dying earlier, and we understand a whole wide range of things that happened because of agriculture. There's definitely benefits. Obviously, we were able to advance beneficial technologies through agriculture, and we're finally at a point perhaps where the benefits have finally overcome all the detriments to the point where we have long enough lifespans that we can live longer than indigenous people did. But if you combine the indigenous practices and diet, and in my argument, as well as the spirituality, because it shapes our worldview and how we go about interacting with other peoples, whether we want to conquer them versus get along and trade with them, you can understand that post-agricultural influence, the only benefit it's given us is the ability to store up more resources so that we can invest them into producing technologies that benefit us. But there was so much problem that came out of this that we're only now just understanding how much detriment this has been over the last couple thousand years. So I think one of the best things that illustrates this is within Europe. When we look at the European peoples, the impact they've had on the world, there's been obviously the benefits of the technologies that I spoke of that have come out of agricultural beliefs, but their impact in a negative sense has been in the decimation of other cultures and even purposely at times trying to wipe out the indigenous traditions of whether it's Australia or the Americas, even parts of Africa. And this imperialism was born, if we keep following it back, it's one culture affecting another, which affects another, which affects another. And it's a domino effect as cultures get bigger and bigger. You know, you have one sort of dominant culture that leads to a bigger dominant culture that leads to a bigger one. So for me personally, being of British descent largely, I have an issue with people saying, you know, the problem in the world was the white people or the British. It's like, no, it was the imperialism of the British. And that happened because the British peoples are genetically largely two different groups, the Celts and the Teutons, meaning the Anglo-Saxons, as well as some Viking influence. And they were just the next domino in a long line of domino effect caused by, previous to them, it was the Romans. So the Romans came in, decimated the Celts. They used the British Isles to launch campaigns against the Germanic tribes in more northern Europe. Once the Romans left, the Teutonic tribes came over to the British Isles at first as mercenaries, but they probably held some animosity against the Celts, the Picts, the Welsh, the Britons. And so they warred against them because they saw them as people who harbored the enemy for so long. For 400 years, the Romans occupied the British Isles. So while you can criticize a culture that's enacting this oppressive force on another, they're almost always doing it because in their history, far enough back, another culture was doing it to them. So it's through this understanding of history that we can connect with the root causes of things, and we can recognize to return to that state of greater health spiritually, we need to go back to before the hurt began. And I'm not saying indigenous cultures were perfect. They were obviously warring, but they didn't have the capacity to outright decimate and oppress other cultures. In most cases, there are obviously examples of that happening. So that kind of wraps up everything I wanted to cover in this elaborate video. Definitely let me know what you think in the comments below. And like, favorite, and share the video if you feel so inclined. And with that, I'll talk to you again soon. May your gods, allies, and ancestors be with you.